The Erdtree, the hulking symbol of the Golden Order looming over the horizon as you struggle towards it, the ultimate goal of the Tardi's ambition and the dwelling of gods of the lands between. But the Erdtree is a tree, obviously, and so it functions as a tree would. So, have you ever wondered how much water or nutrients a tree of that size would need? And would it even be possible for it to survive? Well, you probably haven't, but I have. And since you're here, it must have piqued your interest. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ansgar. I have degrees in biology and medical biotechnology, and today I'm going to find out whether or not the Erdtree would be able to survive in real life. In order to find out the answer, I'll need to determine if it can get enough water and nutrients either through root absorption or photosynthesis. In this video, my main focus will be the water intake itself, as I believe it is a bigger limiting factor than nutrients. Let me explain. There are two main ways that plants gather nutrients they need. The first one is photosynthesis, in which they transform carbon dioxide into carbohydrates using solar power. The second one is absorbing the nutrients dissolved in the water they source through their roots. Pretty much every substance they need other than oxygen and carbon dioxide comes from the soil that the plants drink from. Photosynthesis is a complete non-issue here. The Erdtree is very large and so needs a lot of energy from the process, but its great size also makes its canopy enormous, and so it is really efficient at that. As for other nutrients, I will address this more later in the video, but for now, just know that with how much access the Erdtree has to various areas of the soil, it can very easily enrich itself with everything it could possibly need. So, let's focus on the water now. To estimate Erdtree's water needs, we need to figure out several variables: the size of the Erdtree, its age, as well as what species of plant it is. Let's start with age, as that is the easiest part. The exact age doesn't actually matter. What's important is whether or not it's an adult tree that doesn't grow anymore. Young trees generally are more susceptible to droughts and need water more frequently, as they aren't as hardened yet and their roots are buried in shallow ground. They also use a lot of water for growth. Erdtree is ancient, and we know that it had several phases in its life, though that in itself doesn't mean much. Some trees take very long to mature, and Erdtree might be a particularly extreme outlier due to its sheer size. Originally, the crucible, primordial matter blending all life energy together in a spiral of primordial gold, was situated in the place where Erdtree now grows. The game doesn't explicitly say what form the crucible took, though it is likely it formed a spiral of energy. There are some hints here and there that it was a tree as well, but that's not really important for this video. What is important is that Marika nurtured the Erdtree in the place where the crucible is, and so it is likely the Erdtree sources energy directly from it. So another argument for the photosynthesis not being a limiting factor. Afterwards, once it fully manifested as the symbol of the Golden Order, it entered a phase in which it secreted primordial life energy in a form of sap. This time was known as the Age of Plenty, and it was seen as a sign of abundance. Also important here is the fact that its bark at the time was brown, not golden like later in its life. We'll get to why this is important later. Sap in trees works a bit like blood in animals. It carries water and nutrients in the form of syrup to different parts of the plant, so its cells can use them for energy in various metabolic processes. Generally speaking, from a biological point of view, excessive leaking of sap from a tree is not a good sign, as it's usually caused by mechanical damage, rapid pressure changes, or pests and infections. It doesn't mean the tree is prospering and isn't indicative of its age. However, Erdtree is a bit special, so we can excuse this as the primordial energy from the crucible overflowing in its trunk and leaking through the bark in its intense phase of growth. Something that obviously isn't possible for a regular tree, but seems to be a correct physiological process in its life. Afterwards, the Erdtree ceased the secretion outside of its body, most likely around the time its bark turned gold instead of brown. I think it is safe to say that this was the point it reached full maturity and stopped growing. The amount of sap decreased as it didn't need that many nutrients anymore, and it adapted more to the flow of the primordial energy. So we can determine that Erdtree is in fact a mature tree, with lower water requirements per size than a young one. Now, all this may seem like it's pure conjecture, but everything becomes clear once we look at what happens post-shattering. Once the Elden Ring shatters, most dwellers of the lands between start considering the Erdtree to be withering away. This is because it starts seeding. Erdtree is primarily a religious symbol for the followers of the Golden Order, and it was commonly thought the Erdtree would never bloom or give birth to seeds, as it was believed to be eternal. The Erdtree is very special, so it might as well signal its decline, but that's not really important here. We're not gonna focus on its withering state, as it gets restored in most endings anyway. What is really important here is the fact it seeded itself. You see, no plant can bloom or create seeds without reaching full maturity. Juvenile plants use all the nutrients they get for vegetative growth. Any form of generative processes is reserved for once the plant can safely sustain itself. In other words, Erdtree is most certainly an adult tree. The minor Erdtrees it spawns through the seeds can also give us a little insight into its growing process and confirm what I said before. The young trees birthed with its seeds have brown bark, which seems to be indicative of young age for the Erdtrees, and secrete sap, forming crystal tears beneath them as it gathered. This also confirms the leaking of sap to be a natural process for juvenile Erdtrees. So, we determine that the Erdtree is indeed a mature tree. Now let's focus on its species. Obviously, Erdtree is a one-of-a-kind species of its own, but that doesn't mean it's not related to some other tree species, nor that it's not based on a real-life tree species. And that's our best bet when it comes to estimating its water needs. When it comes to real trees that the Erdtree could be related to, there are two main candidates. The first is Tilia, the linden tree. There are several things in the game pointing to Erdtree's connection with this genus. First of all, Leyndell, royal capital, or to be exact, its etymology. The name of the Golden City is most likely derived from the Old Norse words lind, meaning linden tree, and dalr, meaning valley. In other words, Leyndell literally means linden valley, valley under the linden tree. And guess what tree is towering over the city? This theory is supported by the existence of Mikola's halictree. The halictree doesn't share all characteristics of the Erdtree, but is meant to parallel its existence and serve a similar purpose, only accepting all life in it, kind of like how Crucible did. We can assume, then, that the halictree is, at the very least, a species related to the Erdtree. Now, I want you to look at the list of linden species. There is this one plant here that goes by the name Tilia micheliana. Apart from the very obvious name similarity, this tree is one of the trees that are referred to as Hibakujimoku in Japan. This term is used to describe trees that survived the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Malenia's scarlet Aeonia clearly symbolizes atomic bombs, with its mass senseless destruction and lingering, life-altering effects that last for years after the detonation. And halictree, as we know, is affected by rot due to Malenia's presence and her Aeonia deep in its roots. If we connect the dots here, it is clear that deaths meant for the halictree, and in extension the Erdtree, to be a linden tree. This also fits the setting of Elden Ring being fantasy European Middle Age. Linden trees are very common for mild climate of Northern Hemisphere. Now, there are some problems with this. While Erdtree's shape resembles that of a linden tree, its leaves don't really look all that similar to the limes. So here is where the second candidate comes in. Fraxinus, the ash tree. Why the ash tree? Well, Erdtree's leaves are much more similar to ash trees than linden trees, but that's not all. Erdtree takes some pretty obvious inspiration from Yggdrasil, the sacred tree of Norse cosmology, with everything in universe centered around it, including the 9 worlds. Yggdrasil is primarily described in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, compilatory books of Norse poetry and mythology, and in both of them, it is described as an enormous ash tree. So, the Erdtree is either a linden tree or an ash tree. I'm more willing to bet on linden, but it is inconclusive. Fortunately enough, linden trees and ash trees are both mild climate northern hemisphere trees belonging to flowering plants. As such, their water management and requirements are very similar, so whether the Erdtree is a linden or an ash, the calculations will be mostly the same. Alright, so all that's left now is the size. Based on in-game measurements and player calculations, the Erdtree is around 4,500 meters or 14,764 feet tall and has a 300 meters or 984 feet diameter. If you're interested in details, I highly recommend Zullie's video on Erdtree's size. I'll leave a link to it, as well as all the other sources used in this video, down in the description. Okay, so now we have all the needed variables to calculate the water intake. We know that Erdtree is a mature tree, likely to be a linden, reaching 4,500 meters in height and 300 meters in diameter. An average mature linden tree needs roughly 10 liters of water per 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch of trunk diameter per day. Erdtree's diameter is 300 meters, so 30,000 centimeters. If we divide this by 2.5, we get 12,000. So the Erdtree needs a whopping 12,000 liters or 3,170 gallons of water every single day. The Erdtree is a mild climate tree, so it doesn't really store water like a desert species would. As such, most of the days it would indeed intake as much. It is roughly the equivalent of 25 large, fully developed tropical trees. However, the difference here is that the tropics are very moist. The mild European regions are still fairly moist, especially as close to sea from every side as the lands between, but not nearly as much. So that water intake is rather crazy. In order for the Erdtree to be able to absorb this much water every single day, its roots would need to span several times its canopy, which is already gigantic. So, would it be possible for the Erdtree to sustain itself? Unfortunately, calculating the exact water intake possible would require me to know Erdtree's total root surface and its water absorption efficiency, both of which I am unable to determine because there isn't enough data. What I can do, however, is create a theorized total root surface that it would need to survive. Based on a study researching water absorption of oaks, beeches and spruces, an average temperate mature tree can absorb a maximum of around 2 liters a day per 1 square meter of root surface, with an average of 1 liter a day depending on several factors such as seasonal changes, soil moisture, temperature, soil pH, root maturity, etc. Now, you might have noticed that this study doesn't include linden or ash. However, because all 3 species that were included have very similar habitats and adaptations to that of linden and ash, we can safely assume the estimates are accurate for them as well. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to assume an average of 1 liter per 1 square meter of root surface. In other words, we need at least 12,000 square meters of root surface. Probably a bit more because Erdtree is extremely big and old. So the roots at its very base are so hardened they are barely able to absorb any water at all. And because this much water needs to be found in the first place, the roots need to spread out far. So, considering how far we see Erdtree's roots grow from its trunk, I'd say it is entirely possible for Erdtree to survive. You can find large roots in many underground places around the game's world, such as the catacombs and especially the deep root depths. The catacombs are, in fact, specifically built in places with large concentrations of these roots to be used as burial chambers for fallen champions, so that they can be absorbed into the Erdtree and reborn. And those can be found in the furthest places of the lands between, such as Kalit and the Weeping Peninsula. The lands between are roughly 80 to 90 square kilometers large, so Erdtree's roots spanning over this much area is most certainly enough root surface. I don't even need to make any estimates here. There's no way it is not enough with that much ground coverage. And as I mentioned earlier, with roots spanning the entirety of the lands between and access to deep mineral-rich soil layers, nutrient absorption is simply not the limiting factor here. Water is. Now, I know what many of you might think, that what I'm saying right now is completely wrong. After all, the description of root resin, which can be found on these roots as well as some regular trees outside of them, reads, resin secreted from the roots of the great tree, can also be found near trees on the surface, material used in crafting items. The roots of the great tree were once linked to those of the Erdtree, or so they say, and it is for this reason catacombs are built around great tree roots. It describes great tree as a separate entity that gave birth to many theories, such as the great tree being the crucible, now remaining as roots intertwined with those of the Erdtree. However, great tree is a mistranslation of the original Japanese term used to describe it, taijune, large tree roots, which for some reason became a proper noun in the English localization. In other words, the description should simply say the root resin comes from roots of large trees. And while you can find it around some regular trees too, the large roots in various burial grounds and the depths are very likely to be the genuine Erdtree roots, and if that's the case, its roots cover the underground areas of essentially the entirety of lands between, meaning it has immense total root surface and very good access to underground water sources, including the several rivers flowing through the cavern systems we can find in the game, allowing for very efficient water absorption. So yes, in my opinion, it is entirely possible for the Erdtree to sustain itself, despite its size. Alright, that is all for this video. I hope you found this topic entertaining and that the answer satisfies your curiosity. If you did, consider leaving a like and subscribing to my channel. It greatly helps in its development and will help me work on future projects. Speaking of future projects, this is only the beginning of this series, in which I will deconstruct many biological concepts in video games and maybe some other works of fiction in the future. The next episode will be dropping next Sunday, the same time as today. If you're interested, be sure to turn on notifications and check out my community page for a sneak peek. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!